Well, brothers, welcome back. Our first talk, we looked at two Genesis figures, Adam and Noah. And so this talk, I'll look at one more Genesis figure, namely Jacob, and then at Jonah, who also function, I think, as very interesting archetypes of priesthood. So Jacob, I'm going to focus just on two elements from his marvelous story. I mean, by the way, it's one of the great sort of arcs of a life that we see within the Old Testament narratives. But I'm going to just focus in after the trickery of his brother Esau. He gets the blessing from Isaac, and then he makes his way, he escapes because Esau will be after him. And then we hear that near Beersheba, Jacob took a stone as a sort of improbable pillow, and he lies down for the night. And there he dreams of a ladder set up on the earth, the top of it reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. One of the most famous theophanies in the Bible, a moment of privileged encounter. Jacob undoubtedly was a believer in Yahweh, the God of Israel, but at this place and at that time, he has a real experience of God. That beautiful image of a ladder. Now, in my imagination, from the time I was a kid, I think of like a ladder going up the side of a house. But Robert Alter, the great biblical commentator, says it's probably more likely, think of a ziggurat, a building built like this, kind of like a ramp going from the ground up to the top, the way temples might have been built in certain ancient cultures. The angels of God ascending and descending, meaning it's a place of commerce between heaven and earth. Something of us goes up, something from God comes down. It's a place of contact. It's a conduit. Unique to Jacob? Well, yeah, in a way, but listen to what God says to Jacob. I'm the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your offspring, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth shall be blessed in you. So it's given to Jacob, yes, but by extension to Jacob's family, by extension to Jacob's religious family, Israel, and by extension to the whole world. In a way, the ladder is Israel itself. Israel with its covenants and with its prophecy, with its patriarchs and kings, with its commandments, with its temple. All the institutions of Israel are the means by which God effects a relationship between this world and himself. But then in that place of contact, the whole world will be blessed. Beautiful. In a way, it's a description of Israel in all of its various aspects. Now, we Christians know Jesus himself claims this image in a very powerful way. Remember in the scene with Nathanael? The Lord says, do you believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? Nathanael, you'll see greater things than these. Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Christ now claims that he himself is Jacob's ladder. He himself is the summation of Israel, of prophecy and temple and covenant. He himself is the one in whom the whole world will be blessed. So this image is of extreme power and of extreme importance for all biblically formed people. But now here's the thing, brothers, I'd like you to reflect on. What for you was this place? What for you was Jacob's ladder? And I know there was something, because you would not be listening to this talk if there weren't. You would not be here on this retreat unless you had experienced something very much like this. Yeah, maybe you were a believer, sure, you were brought up within the faith, but at some point, the heavens opened up. At some point, a place on the earth became, as it were, radioactive. How beautiful that Jacob, after this experience, he puts oil on that stone he'd used as a pillow. He sacralized it. There's some moment in your life when the angels of God were ascending and descending upon that place. You know, for me, I've talked about it a lot. I was a Catholic kid, you know, raised in the faith, went to church on Sunday, and certainly was a believer. But it was an experience when I was a freshman in high school, so I was 14 years old, and a Dominican friar at Fenwick High School opened up for us one of Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God's existence. And I think it probably bored the entire class, but I don't know why. I don't know why. To this day, I really don't know why. But for me, it was like the heavens opened and like the angels of God were ascending and descending on that place. That for me became a privileged moment of encounter with God. And no kidding, brothers, when I tell you, no kidding, it has shaped me to this day and to this moment as I'm standing giving this talk. Remember in the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 6, when Isaiah talks about the moment in the temple when suddenly it was filled with the presence of God. And Isaiah remembers it was in the year that King Uzziah died. In other words, he remembered. It was such a powerful moment that he remembered the time and the place. What was it for you? I think it's very important, especially for those of us who've been at this for a while. And we might get distracted by, the cares of our pastoral work. Maybe we're discouraged in ways. Maybe, the secular society kind of wear us down. Maybe we've lost some of the enthusiasm of our youth. Remember that time. What was it for you, the year that King Uzziah died and the temple, Lord, was filled with his presence? What was it for you when suddenly the angels of God were ascending and descending? Find it again. Find the energy of that place. I might suggest during this retreat, spend a holy hour just with this. So I shared my experience of hearing this Aquinas argument when I was a freshman in high school. What was it for you? I don't know if you know this movie. It's not a great movie. It's called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. It was done back in the 60s about St. Francis. But there's a scene in it I've always loved, and you can find it on YouTube. Just look it up. Francis visits the Pope or visits Innocent III. You can find it. And it's the scene in the life of Francis where he and his little ragtag band of followers come into the great papal court of Innocent III to seek his approbation. Well, in the scene, it's Franco Zeffirelli does the movie, and it's, with this sumptuous, opulent place filled with, bishops and cardinals and all their regalia and, all the finery. And the Pope, by the way, played by the great Alec Guinness, is up on a high dais, and he's just enveloped in this jewel-encrusted cope, and he has his mitre on, his eyes are closed. And into the place comes Francis with his dirty feet and his unkempt hair and habit, he and his little band of followers. And everyone's kind of scandalized just by their presence. Well, then Francis begins, not in his own words, just in the words of Jesus. He begins to preach from the Sermon on the Mount. He begins to talk about simplicity and poverty and humility and trust in God's providence. Well, they don't miss the message. All of the courtiers are just outraged. How could this man come into the Pope's palace and insult him this way? And so then Francis is picked up bodily and carried out. Well, then the camera goes to Alec Guinness playing the Pope. And he rises, his eyes still closed, but rises from his seat. And he puts his hand up in the air very dramatically. And then he says, call them back. So then they bring Francis and his band back. And the Pope then dramatically descends this long staircase. He comes down to Francis' level. And then to the gasps of the crowd, he bends down and he kisses the dirty feet of Francis. Well, then when he rises, what he says to him is the heart of the scene. He says, I too, many years ago, became a priest with the same enthusiasm and faith that you're demonstrating right now. But as you can tell, years of practical administration and ecclesiastical affairs have shrouded that original enthusiasm. And I see it again in you. Well, that's Jacob's ladder, isn't it? Is the presence of Francis reminded Innocent III of the moment in his own life when God spoke to him, when the heavens opened up, inspiring him to be a priest. What was that for you? What was that for you? When was that? The year that King Uzziah died. What was it? Spend some time today recovering that place. And maybe there are some of you who feel a bit like old Innocent III, feel a bit jaded and maybe divorced from what had first inspired you. Find it again. Now, here's something else about Jacob's ladder. So it happens to Jacob, and then Jesus himself claims this image. You will see the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man, meaning he is himself the ladder par excellence. Well, brothers in the priesthood, all of us, through ordination, have become other Christs. We're not just followers of Jesus, certainly not just admirers of Jesus. We've been grafted onto him, and we share in his personal identity, which means we ourselves become Jacob's ladders. So as I've been saying, in our own lives, we can find that moment when we experience that. But now, see, by ordination, we all become ourselves Jacob's ladders. We become in our persons the place where the angels of God ascend and descend. Oh, because we're such morally wonderful people. No, it's not a question of morally superior or not. It's a question of our sacramental identity. And I think, brothers, it's a really good way to think about our priesthood. To be an effective Jacob's ladder, we must be simultaneously rooted and grounded in the earth and ordered to heaven at the same time. Otherwise, we're not a ladder. So think of someone who is just completely grounded in the earth. They are really close to people. They understand their motivations, their psychology. They're really one with the people, but they're not linked to heaven. Well, you might be a great sociologist. You might be a great psychologist. You might be a great friend. Nothing wrong with any of that, but you're not a priest because you're not connecting people to a higher realm. Or turn around. Someone is completely ordered to the higher dimension. They're caught up always in the things of God. Well, great. That might make you a wonderful poet or theologian or monk or mystical professor, but it won't make you a priest. A priest has got to be a Jacob's ladder, grounded in the earth, ordered to heaven at the same time. My mother told this story. I mean, this goes back many years, so way before Vatican II. And a young priest became kind of a friend of their family. And he told them that when he was in the seminary, they were taught, now, when people come to see you in the rectory, They should never see you coming down the stairs. You should just kind of appear, I guess in the office, or appear. They shouldn't know where you're coming from because you have to maintain your kind of mystical identity. Well, that's a little silly. We're not angels. The angels ascend and descend on us, right? So we've got to be grounded in people's lives. But now, turn that around, because when I was going through seminary, trust me, it was the opposite problem. Is we so emphasized, you're one with the people, you're not different, talk like them, dress like them, act like them, you're with the people. Well, okay, but the problem there was that we didn't serve as a conduit to a higher world. The trick is, and great priests know about this, they know how to do it, is to do both at the same time. Yes, you know your people and their struggles. No, you're not hovering above them. Look at, Pope Francis telling us so clearly, you have the smell of the sheep. Of course you do. And they've got a sense in you, brothers, that you're a person of prayer, that you are, to some degree, living in this higher world of God. Otherwise, you can't bring them to it. That's where the holy hour, that's where spiritual reading, that's where theological study, that's where time for meditation, that's where the liturgy, that's where that all comes in. You got to be in your own life a Jacob's ladder. So I might propose a second point of meditation for you today is use that image to think about your own priesthood. Chances are we're kind of better at one end or the other of Jacob's ladder. All right, maybe identify that and say, okay, that's where I need to do a little work. I need to get better at the heavenly side of that ladder or the earthly side. Because without the two, you ain't going to function as a ladder. Okay, here's the second thing about Jacob I want to focus on. And it's what he's probably best known for, which is the famous wrestling match. So now after many, many years, he's with Laban, who's the brother of his mother, and then he's married to Rachel and to Leah, and there's all these stories involved. But finally, he wants to reconcile with Esau, his brother, and so he goes out to meet him. It's a beautiful detail as the story opens. They're twins, of course, Jacob and Esau, and Jacob is grasping at the heel of Esau. And so from the beginning, he's a wrestler. From the beginning, he's a grappler. And all his life long, he grapples. Well, here's the most famous. So the night before the encounter with Esau, all it says in the Bible is, a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Who was he? He's called a man here. He's also referred to as an angel. There's even the implication that God himself. It's typical of the Bible that it's a bit multivalent here. Wrestles with him all night. So, again, so laconically expressed, wrestle with him till daybreak. That's quite a wrestling match. That's hours and hours and hours long. After it, he gets a new name, Israel, which has the very sense of the one who has struggled, the one who has wrestled. Listen, you shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with humans and have prevailed. Brothers, in almost any philosophy, religious philosophy or mysticism of the world, there's a stress on our quest for God. That we climb the holy mountain, that we ask the deep questions, that we seek truth. Okay, and nothing the matter with that. Yes, that there's something right about it. But the Bible is not the story of our quest for God. It's not the story of our mystical ascent. Not the story, certainly, of some divine reality that's sort of passively at a distance and we're just trying to, through our efforts, climb the holy mountain. That is not the story of the Bible at all. And it sets the Bible apart from almost any book of spirituality and mysticism you can find in the bookstores today. Rather, the Bible is a story of God's relentless quest for us. God is after us. So the hound of heaven, that names the biblical idea much more accurately. But I love the detail here. Yes, God pursues us even to the point of wrestling with us all night and not letting go. God's after us. And when God finds us, he wrestles with us. What does wrestling do? I did a little bit when I was a young guy, but when you're really wrestling with someone, I mean, it's calling forth all of your powers. I played a lot of sports as a kid, but honestly, nothing ever exhausted me as quickly as wrestling. I played baseball, football, basketball. Now I play golf, which isn't very exhausting. But when I wrestled a little bit, I mean, like in a minute, you are exhausted from the effort of a real wrestling match. So God, when we sinners, we're trying to run away from him in all kinds of ways. That's the name of the game, isn't it? We're running away. But he's after us, and he will get us and wrestle with us and call forth all the strength that we've got. That's an image of the spiritual life in the Bible. In other words, it's not a sort of calm, mystical assent. It's not a philosophical musing. That's not the Bible. It's a wrestling match with God who won't let us go until he's blessed us. Isn't that beautiful detail? Jacob is wounded in the struggle. As we always are in the struggle with God. Are you kidding? We're always wounded. It always affects us in some way. But it's also at the same time a blessing. I think, brothers, it's true of I think any baptized person, but I think especially for us priests. We signed up for this. We've decided, okay, I'm going to enter into the list with this God. I think a lot of what it means to be a priest is to say, I'm willing to enter into this wrestling match with the Lord God. I think in my own life, I spent a lot of years as a theologian, a teacher, a writer, speaker. Well, the wrestling with God that I did was at this intellectual level, trying to understand what is he and who is he and what's he doing and the mystery of the incarnation and the Trinity and the church and salvation and the cross. A lot of my life has been that. It's been wrestling with God. Being wounded in the process, you bet. But blessed too. And all of you, in our own way, we all do. Anyone involved in pastoral ministry, you're visiting a hospital, here's someone that 1 minute was doing perfectly fine, the next minute they're at death's door. You're dealing with families going through enormous struggles and heartbreak. And we wonder, a child who's dying, and we wonder, what is God up to? Why could this be happening? We wrestle with God. We wrestle with God. And the point, brothers, is we wrestle with God on behalf of our people. See, for the sake of our people. So they can turn to us who have been wounded and blessed in that struggle. And they sense that, don't they? You know that from your pastoral work. They sense when a preacher is someone who's also a wrestler. Like, yeah, that guy, he's not just spouting off language he read in a book somewhere. He's wrestled with God. He's wounded by that, and he's been blessed by it, And so maybe in the course of your meditation today, find that moment too, when you have most painfully wrestled with God. Do you exist? What are you about? What do you want? Why do you do the things you do? How long did Jacob wrestle? All night, not just for a little tussle for 5 minutes. See, but that's the priesthood, I think, brothers, in many ways, is that we've dedicated to this. We're going to spend our lives wrestling with the Lord. So find that moment, but realize, yeah, it wounded you, and it'll keep wounding you, but it blesses you at the same time, and you're blessed not for you. You're blessed for the people you serve. Okay? So we got Adam, we got Noah, we got Jacob, all priestly archetypes. So finally, in the last minutes I got, Let me say a word about Jonah. I mentioned Noah is the most famous sailor. Jonah probably is the second most famous sailor in the Bible. You can read the book of Jonah. I recommend you do it during the retreat. It'll take you, 10 minutes to read. But has that book ever punched above its weight when it comes to impact? Because the poets and the writers and the painters who have been intrigued by the book of Jonah are numberless. And it's full of spiritual wisdom, and I think especially for us priests. Here's how it starts. Now the word of God came to Jonah, son of Amittai, saying, "Go at once to Nineveh, the great city, and cry out against it." So Jonah, like all the great figures in the Bible, has heard a higher voice. This is from Abraham, all of them, Moses, Joshua, Samuel, David. They all hear a higher voice, beyond the voices of the world. Right? So we all hear the typical voices of our parents and our society and our culture and our pop culture, and they're all telling us what to do. Well, these biblical heroes are those who hear a higher voice amidst all that cacophony. So Jonah does. But God, talk about a wrestler. God always gives us a difficult assignment. He just does. I don't know an exception to that in the Bible, because he's calling us beyond our sinful selves to a deeper life. So that will always appear as something hard, right? So the assignment he gives is go to Nineveh. Well, Nineveh was the capital of the Assyrian Empire, one of the most implacable enemies of Israel. Nineveh, its great capital city, long way from where Jonah was. And cry out against it. Cry out that it should repent. Well, good luck with that. That's like a terrifically difficult assignment. Dangerous. You put your life in danger. You go to the capital city of your enemy and say, you people all need to repent, and there's one of you and there's hundreds of thousands of them. So Jonah, understandably, refuses. God said, go east by land. Jonah went west by sea. So Jonah books passage on a ship, and he sets off to Tarshish, we are told. And I love the fact the scholars kind of disagree about where Tarshish was. But the consensus seems to be Tarshish was a reference to far southern Spain, what they call the Pillars of Hercules in the ancient world, right, where the Mediterranean and Atlantic come together. But what it meant, see, for a biblical person who didn't dream of the continent we live on, what Tarshish meant was the end of the world. So Jonah is told, all right, go to Nineveh. No, I'm going to go the opposite direction to the end of the world. In other words, he's someone who is massively and radically refusing his mission. Nobody in the Bible is ever given an experience of God without being given a mission. That's just the way it works. God encounters us and then he sends us. That's always the case. There's not one exception in the Bible. So Jonah's got his mission. All right. But he refuses it. Now, we're all sinners, right? We all, to varying degrees, do exactly this. We refuse what God wants us to do. Now why? We'll go right back to the book of Genesis. Because I eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I decide what's right and wrong for me. Your life isn't about you. It's about what God wants to do through you. So Jonah is just a descendant of Adam here. He's just claiming his own authority and running from God. Well, what happens? He gets on the boat, and almost immediately a storm kicks up. Well, now we know what that is. That's the tohu vabohu, right? There's the watery chaos that always accompanies sin. When you refuse your mission, trouble comes for you, and, if I can be blunt, for everybody around you. So Jonah's on board ship with all these other people. They don't know who he is from Adam. It's not their business. But yet they're caught up in the fact that this great storm is threatening the entire ship. So it goes, brothers, in the mystical body. For weal or for woe, we're all connected to each other. When we refuse our mission, it's bad for us, And it's bad for all the people we were meant to help and to touch and to change by accepting our mission. And so the tohu vabohu comes back. They figure out pretty quickly it's Jonah, and he, to his credit, owns up to it. He says, yeah, I know, I'm the cause of this trouble because I'm running away from God. And so he says, pick me up, throw me into the sea, and then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it's because of me this great storm has come upon you. All right, again, to his credit, he admits that. And so they throw him into the sea, and the sea calms down. End of story? No, we're just getting started. Because God is not localizable. It's not like I can run away from God. Oh, God's over here, I'm going to go over there. God's on land, I'll go by sea. Oh, come on. He's the creator of the heavens and the earth. He's the sustainer of all things. And so, of course, God sends the great fish that swallows up Jonah. And now here's, brothers, in some ways, the very heart of the story. So stay with that image for a bit. Jonah, the reluctant prophet, now swallowed up by this fish. So he's confined in this horrific space. He can't move, can't breathe. Confined and now carried against his will. So he doesn't know where this fish is going. He's going where the fish wants to go, not where he wants to go. And from that terrible place, he cries out this famous De Profundis prayer, right? From the depths, Lord, I cry out to you. But here's what I want you to stay with the image for this reason. How do we interpret, brothers, when we go through in our lives periods of depression, periods of fear, periods of deep anxiety? We can say, oh, it's just dumb suffering, or we can assign other psychological reasons for it or physiological reasons. But if we pursue it theologically, how might we read experiences like that? Is it God's way of confining our own will, our own sense of self-direction and self-purpose? A kind of shutting down of that errant self that's born of Adam's move. I'm going to grasp the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I'll set the tone for my life. And God has to compel us to go through a sort of dark night of the soul. It's never fun having our errant will confined, is it? It's never fun being disciplined that way. Think of so many of the great spiritual heroes, the great spiritual writers. They almost all had an experience like Jonah's. When you read the great spiritual masters, it's never like just leaping from success to success. Almost invariably, they have to go through a desert time. They have to go through a dark night, or they have to go through a time of confinement, so that their wills can be conformed unto God's will. Now, see, look at this. God sent the fish. It wasn't just dumbly there. God sends the fish. God directs the fish, now with Jonah in it, and spews him up on the land, which is precisely where God wanted him to be. Where's our struggle, our pain come from, brothers? Very often from resistance to God's will. You know, we resist it. We know what God wants. He's told us. He's given us a mission. And everyone listening to me right now, we've all received a mission from God. We know what it is. We know what it is. It's the great mission of the priesthood, and to live that as fully and radically as we can. To what degree, I'll include myself here, to what degree are we resisting it? And is that resistance kicking up storms that are threatening ourselves and people around us? Or are we perhaps at the moment when we are confined, anxious, depressed, lonely? What's going on? Dumb suffering? Or perhaps our wills being confined and conformed unto God's holy will. Are we waiting perhaps to be spewed up on the land precisely where God wants us to be? You know, I used that phrase a little while ago, your life is not about you. And it's one that has always spoken to me very profoundly about the spiritual life. Our secular culture, teaches in 1,000 ways. Of course your life's about you. That's all it is. It's your life. I do it my way. Don't tell me what to do. I got to find my voice. Watch every movie ever made. That's what they're all about. But the Bible is uninterested in that. That's a recipe for disaster. Rather, my life is not about me. It's about what God wants to accomplish through me. It's not about my trip to Tarshish. God doesn't care about that. Are we allowing ourselves to be carried by this higher will where God wants us to be? And then Jonah, all right, he says, okay, I surrender, Lord. I'll do what you want. And he does come to Nineveh. And this is where the book of Jonah is, of course, famously funny. We're not going to sense it because we read it always very solemnly in church, but it's a very funny book. He preaches repentance. What happens? And the people of Nineveh believe God. They proclaimed a fast. And everyone, great and small, put on sackcloth. Wow, he's a pretty successful preacher. In fact, so successful, it reaches the king. When the news reached the king of Nineveh, he rose from his throne, removed his robe, covered himself with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. Wow, the king repents because of Jonah's preaching. And then here's how the book ends, again, comically. Human beings and animals were covered with sackcloth, and they all cried mightily to God. So he converted the animals. He converted the people, the king, the animals were converted. What's the point? The point is there is no limit to what God can accomplish if and when we surrender to his purposes. And God knows what he's about. He sent Jonah on this mission. Oh, God, I can't do it. No, not Nineveh. No way. I'm running to Tarshish. No, but God doesn't give up. God doesn't give up on Jonah. No, he tracks him down, swallows him up, limits his will, carries him where he wants him to go. And then when Jonah is finally willing to surrender, God works so mightily through him that he transfigures this whole pagan enemy city from top to bottom. I don't know, brothers, but think about our society today, so characterized by secularism, often by a deep hostility to religion. It's Nineveh. Could it be that we, at this particular time, you ever wonder that, why was I born when I was born? I've often mused, I know it's crazy, but gosh, if I'd been born 70 years earlier, it would have been a lot easier to be a priest. And that's probably true in our culture. The way, religion was revered and the way priests were treated, go back to the 1950. Yeah, okay, so what, God would say. But I created you at your time, and I got a mission for you right now. Don't you worry about, what might have been. That's not your business. I got the mission for you. Go to Nineveh. Oh, Lord, not Nineveh. If we even now surrender to God's purpose for us, there is no limit to what God can accomplish through us. So I think, brothers, take courage in both those images of Jacob and Jonah. Be a Jacob's ladder. Don't be afraid of wrestling with God. Surrender to God's purpose. You'll set the world on fire. And God bless you.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host, and joining me is the Bishop of Catholic Social Media. We're going to talk about that title here in just a second. Bishop Aaron, welcome.
Hey, Brandon. Always good to be with you.
Hey, before we get to the topic of today's show, which is a bishop's guide to social media, I want to talk about two super exciting interviews that you just did. Now, this podcast episode is going to be airing a little later in December, so by then, these interviews will have already aired. But I'm talking, of course, about your interview with Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin. Talk a little bit about those two experiences.
Yeah, they both were good. They're based here in the LA area. And I've been on Dave Rubin's show before, about a year and a half ago. And he's got a very strong presence in social media. It's an interview program that goes out through YouTube and Facebook and various forums. And, it has all kinds of interesting people on. It's been a very lively show. And of course, Ben Shapiro, I'd never met before the interview. Same thing. He has a strong, social media presence. And he does a very high level interview program for Sundays that's often with kind of, cultural figures, but leaning toward religious figures. So I was, delighted to be asked to be on both those programs. Shapiro was especially kind of high level. I mean, he had a whole set of questions about philosophy, about theology, about the relation between Judaism and Christianity. So I found it, really stimulating, really interesting. And then Dave Rubin had me on with Rabbi Wolpe, who's one of the best known rabbis in the country, based here in LA. So we talked a lot about, again, religion, society, Judaism, Christianity, secularism, all those topics. So I enjoyed both conversations a lot.
What is it about these sorts of interviews where you're not in a churchy space, you're not, interviewing on a Catholic radio station, God bless them as good as they are, of course. What is it about these sorts of opportunities that particularly excites you?
Yeah, and you just said it there. It's the what we call the odd extra, the moving outside of the walls of the church into the wider cultural space. And I'm very interested in that. Catholicism at its best always has been interested in moving outside its own kind of narrow framework and addressing the wider culture. So, Dave Rubin has announced himself really as a non-believer. Ben Shapiro is a very devout Orthodox Jew. I say two great people for a Catholic bishop to be talking to. And I was happy, by the way, that with both Shapiro and Rubin, we did that. I mean, we talked about Christianity in relation to like an Enlightenment view of the world in Dave Rubin's case, and a Jewish view of the world in Ben Shapiro's case. So anyway, I found that great. And odd extra, the church that, as the Pope says, goes out to the existential margins.
In some ways, people like Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro are kind of some of the major thought leaders, if you want to use that term of today. You, of course, would be described the same way in the Catholic space. It reminds me, at the risk of being a little grandiose, of the way that Thomas Aquinas interacted with Maimonides and Aristotle and the great thinkers of other religious traditions. It seems you've said this many times, you want to bring back that sort of engagement where we're not just sort of blandly tolerating each other, but we're interacting, we're talking and discussing our differences.
Yeah, and I'm glad you're right. I don't want to compare myself to Thomas Aquinas, who's my great hero, but at least in that measure, that what Thomas did in the Middle Ages, namely to have a really lively, respectful, engaged conversation with a range of voices, Catholic, non-Catholic, Christian, non-Christian, believer, non-believer. So think of Thomas dialoguing with classical paganism, Thomas dialoguing with Judaism, Thomas dialoguing with Islam, Thomas dialoguing with different schools within the Catholic intellectual tradition that he wouldn't necessarily be sympathetic with. Good. That's the model. It's neither violence nor bland toleration, but it's a active, respectful engagement through argumentation. And I think that's really a good thing, an important thing in our society and our church today.
Well, the topic of this show is a bishop's guide to social media. And I kind of took the title from a Wall Street Journal article, which just ran, that profiled you. And that article was titled "The Bishop of Catholic Social Media." So first of all, how'd you feel about that title?
Well, it's okay. I never aspired to that. We got into social media years ago when I was a priest of Chicago and I was a teacher at Mundelein Seminary. And we thought, well, let's use this means to get the message out to a wider world. That's it. That's how I started. Now, in that process, I I grew up to be rector of the seminary, then eventually bishop, but I didn't really think of putting those two things together. Like, boy, I want to be the bishop of social media. So it just kind of happened that way. But, okay, in the measure that that's a space that I inhabit in a sort of missionary spirit. I think bishops are evangelizers. I mean, I go back to the early church. Not so much bureaucrats, and I get nothing against bureaucracy. We need it. And not so much administrators. Nothing against that. We need that too. But I think bishops in the early church were proclaimers of the gospel. And so is it appropriate that a bishop be in this social media space to announce the gospel? Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not, bishop of it in some sort of supervisory way, but part of it and involved in it, yeah, I'll claim that. That's okay.
I still think for many people, it's strange seeing those words juxtaposed, bishop and social media. I know when I first started getting into this space, I wrote my first book, The Church and New Media, which you
Hmm.
contributed to. And that
Yeah.
book sort of launched me around different conferences and tours. But everywhere I would go, whenever I would give talks, most church leaders, virtually all priests, and every bishop that I talked to was really skeptical and nervous
Yeah.
about social media. It seems, though, that the tide has slowly changed. Have you
Hmm.
seen that among some of your fellow bishops and priests?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because people just got used to it. The social media, as you and I have both said many times, is the Areopagus of today. So Paul goes into Athens, this great cultural capital. He goes to the place where opinions are being shared and where everyone is engaged in public debate. Well, that's where he went. That's where St. Paul went and got in that conversation. And there's so much to like about that story, but one of them is that Paul was almost exclusively repudiated. I mean, almost everybody scoffed, laughed, walked away, right? But the tiny handful that remained were some of the seeds of European Christianity, which meant the Christianity that went all over the world. So my point is, we go into our Areopagus as Paul went into his, knowing all the dangers, knowing all the drawbacks, knowing that we'll be attacked and repudiated and laughed at by a lot of people. Um, okay, but that's the missionary call. It always has been difficult. It's always been painful. It's always been a great challenge, but that's where we go, you know?
Now, you've been on social media for the past 10 years or so, and not only as a producer, you're not only producing content, but you use these tools. You got the Facebook app and the YouTube app on your
Yeah,
phones. I mean, you use them almost every day. So I wanted to get your feedback as a social media user and
yeah.
maybe pull out some of your experiences. So, first of all, what's your general view of social media? Good, bad, mixture? What's your take?
Yeah, it's a mix, like everything else in human experience. It's a mix of good and bad. I think every day I experience what's wonderful about it, and every day I experience what's bad about it. But that's okay. That's the way it goes in our fallen, conflictual world. Everything human goes bad to some degree. The best things, think of the best achievements of humanity. They're all corrupt, at least around the edges, because we're sinners. Those who invent them, those that use them, are sinners. So that's not surprising. So I experience it every day, I'd say, as a mix of good and bad.
How about specifically on YouTube? That was one of the first platforms that
Yeah.
you started using. And more specifically, how about the comment boxes of YouTube? What have been your experiences there?
Well, again, I say both good and bad. I've often mentioned that in the beginning, I didn't know there were comment boxes. That was sort of new to me. But I've never sympathized with the disable comments thing, even though you get an awful lot of negativity in those comment boxes. I still believe in them, and I've experienced again every day and over the years many times the positive side, which is a real engagement with people that is intellectually and even spiritually constructive. You do a video, someone responds 94.8% of the time negatively, right? People rarely write in to say, my goodness, did I like that video? Thank you, Bishop. I mean, that's just extremely rare. So it's almost always someone saying, hey, okay, well, I got a little foothold now. I know, okay, here's what's bugging you. And maybe I can, nuance this thing or clarify something. And sometimes, and I can show you, really good conversations have ensued. Once we get past the kind of emotional static, do you know what I mean? again, nothing against the emotions, don't get me wrong, but there's a static quality to emotion. Anger and I'm insulted and blah, 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 blah. And both sides do all this business. It's like, all right. Can we let that clear? Now, what's at stake here? What claim are you making? What's the counterclaim I'm making? Which of us do you think is at least relatively right about this? Once we clear some of the static, we can actually get at that. Less so today because I don't have as much time, but years ago when I first started, sometimes I'd have these long conversations. Since somebody was thoughtful in the double sense of that term, they were smart and they were considerate, that we could actually make some progress. We could actually say, yeah, this is really clarifying some important things about the faith. So I like that in the com boxes. I think that can be a really constructive thing. And the com boxes can be awful places, as you and I both know, and everyone knows that. Sometimes that emotional static I talked about can be just like a firestorm. It can just turn into nothing but two egos hurling invective at each other, confirming each other in their very worst qualities, So I get that. And as everyone has said, social media allows that worst of us to come out, because, and see, at least now, you and I are seeing each other. We're able to talk to each other. I can see, there's a human being sitting over there in Orlando, and if I say something really wounding to you, I might even see it reflected in your face, Well, that is a good constraint upon it. But we can't do that. It's just words appearing in a com box. And which of us can be sharper, smarter? Which of us can express hurt feelings with more anger? Once that happens, it's just, okay, there should be a referee, to throw a white flag and say, okay, all right, that's the end. No more of this conversation. It's going nowhere good. But as you know, there isn't a referee. And so sometimes these things can just go on and on and on and produce nothing but smoke and heat and anger,
See, that's why we need a bishop of Catholic social media to adjudicate.
Oh yeah,
these
that's my job
discussions.
to throw the penalty flag. Boy, I'd be busy
you could
man.
Use your mitre to kind of hook people as they go off the.
I'd be
the
a very busy man. And that's part of the problem too. Is there you are, you're in your home space, you're in a comfortable setting, and all you got to do, if you know how to type, is it just takes you a couple minutes. At least years ago, you'd have to sit down and write an angry letter. You have to put it in an envelope and put a stamp on it, address it, send it to a magazine or a newspaper. Now just boop, fire something off, So that's the shadow side.
One thing I struggle with is I totally agree that the anonymity of the internet tends to inflate and stir up all of this anger and animosity and venom. But from an evangelistic perspective, I also know that there's a certain power in allowing people to be anonymous online. I've seen it when I converted to Catholicism. I didn't know any other Catholics.
Yeah.
Was a little nervous about the fact that I was looking into Catholicism, but I could do it sort of secretly online. And I know a lot of people engage your content that way. Can you talk a little bit about the value of the anonymous culture?
Yeah, I think so. And I'll tell you, this story has been told a number of times to me. Someone will write to me and say, I didn't get on the comment box, but I paid very close attention to it. When you were engaging that guy, remember a long time ago about that argument for God's existence thing? I'm like, vaguely. Well, the person will say, I was like just waiting on every word, what's he going to say? And what's the right response to that? And so in a very anonymous way, this person was actually benefiting from this evangelizing that was going on, maybe even despite myself. There was an evangelizing going on, and someone anonymously, very silently out there in cyberspace was benefiting from it. And yeah, someone who might be too shy ever to say, I'm going to call or I'm going to write to Bishop Barron, well, they can jump on, and if things aren't going well, okay, just get off or delete my comment or something. So yeah, I can see it inviting someone in a very non-threatening way to get into the conversation.
Well, as I mentioned, you've had several conversations with people over the years. You're not just pumping out videos and articles, you're using the social dimension of social media as well. Maybe you can give advice to some of the Catholics listening who maybe are on Facebook, they're trying to evangelize friends and family. I guess two questions I'd be interested to know is, number one, how do you identify which conversations are worth pursuing? There's 100 comment threads. How do we know which one to pick? And then number two, how do you determine when it's time to bow out? How do you know when this isn't really going anywhere?
It's when the emotional storm is broken out and the emotional rain is just falling. Then it's time to get out because then we're not getting anywhere. We're not getting a truth. And I think you can sort of sniff out. You can determine as you look through a number of things. Oh yeah, there's actually an argument being made there. Uh, that's why training in logic, Brandon. I know it sounds kind of arcane, but training in logic is really helpful. What are the logical moves being made? What are the logical fallacies? We talked about that. Was it last time we were together?
Hmm.
But that's very interesting. What are the logical fallacies that are being employed here? But I think if you can sniff out an argument, you can sniff out a bit of goodwill. Fine, get involved in that conversation. When the emotional rain starts falling and it's just a sharing of anger, a venting of spleens, then it's time to get out of that conversation. When you're feeling and I felt that I'm getting stirred up in this sort of anti-personal way. Like I'm against this guy. This guy is getting on my nerves. It's time to get out because now you're harming rather than illuminating. And that does take a lot of spiritual and psychological discipline to be able to do that. And a bit of advice I've given others, I give myself too, is remember, behind those words is a person. And the words they appear so baldly on the screen. They can be obscene, they can be hate-filled, they can be venomous. But okay, somewhere out there in cyberspace is someone who wrote those words. And try to imagine that person, and that might curtail your desire to like, hey, just get back and let me show you I'm cleverer than you are. And remember there's a person out there. And then I'd say shut the thing down when it's just an emotional rain falling.
I know one thing that worries a lot of people on social media, especially Catholics, is the tendency of many of these tools to develop into just sort of an echo chamber. And I think it's kind of built into the tools themselves because like the Facebook newsfeed will cater the stuff you see based around the stuff you already like and the stuff that you already share. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling.
It's the shadow side of all that.
Yeah.
It's funny.
How do we get out of that?
Well, I'm not sure how we get out of it. But let me just last night, I happened to stumble on PBS, a program on Bob Hope. Now, younger people don't even remember who Bob Hope was. But, when I was a kid, Bob Hope was he was older man, but his career was still going. And one of the most popular entertainers of the 20th century, period. But here's what struck me is they were saying how Bob Hope was in some ways, even before Johnny Carson and those people, doing topical humor. Like he would kind of make fun of politicians and all this. But as you watched him, and I remember this from Bob Hope, it wasn't this sort of mean-spirited, sharply political attack. It was more playful, and it was kind of, the silly side of things, or it was sort of making little light banter. Now, the reason is, Bob Hope had to appeal to everybody, right? He was one of the few programs on TV. I remember that when I was a kid, boom, 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 boom. You had 4 channels on TV, basically. So when Bob Hope came on, Bob Hope couldn't appeal to like some little tiny swath of the conservative audience or the liberal audience. He would appeal to everybody, in a way that made us gentler. See now though, with such niche audiences, so I'm a comedian, I'm appealing to this one extreme left feather of the left wing of the political conversation, or the right feather of the right wing. That's demeaned us in a way, and it's contributed to, as you say, the echo chamber. So the handful of people that believe this narrow perspective, I'll tell jokes to them that they'll like. And then the handful of people on the other side, who are the comedians who would speak to everybody? That everybody, like Carson too is a good example. Johnny Carson had to appeal to the whole country. He couldn't be like polemically Republican or polemically Democratic. And that's a problem. The specification of the audience has led to some of this polarization.
One question I have is when you look at the earliest Christians, they were able to grow so quickly because they were distinct. They were different from the surrounding culture, and people noticed the magnanimous way they loved people or the way they cared for the poor, the orphan, the widows. Do you think there's a distinctly Christian way to use social media? What would that look like?
It would look like love. And you're right. If people from the outside are watching and listening to us Catholics talk, and all they hear is bitter polemics, that'll attract nobody. Even if they say, "Oh yeah, I think his argument's right," it'll attract nobody. You do it with love. Love means willing the good of the other. So I'm trying to tell the truth. Let's say as an evangelist, okay, good, but the truth in love, veritas in caritate. If I'm telling the truth but not in love, people aren't going to listen. But if they sense, oh yeah, this is a good-hearted person who really wants others to know this truth that he's found very winsome, good. I think they will find that appealing. So just as we reached out in the early days to the poor and to the sick, we cared for the newborns, which ancient Roman society often didn't. That made Christianity very attractive. So the manner of our dialogue can be attractive or unattractive evangelically. If we fall into ranting and raving at each other, we'll attract nobody outside of our little narrow conversation.
I want to invite you to put your spiritual director hat on now. I've talked to a lot of priests recently who have told me that they've seen an enormous rise of people coming to them both for pastoral counsel and for confession with issues related to social media. You
Mm-hmm.
got the addictive quality of social media. A lot of people are worried that social media is crowding out their spiritual life. You know, they
Yeah.
say, I check my phone first thing in the morning. It's the last thing I look at night, but I don't really pray anymore. What spiritual counsel and advice would you offer Christians in regards to these tools?
We should do a whole program on this because I think it's super important, Brandon. I just read an article recently. Now, where was it? But the author was making, I thought, very wise suggestions about, for example, when a family sits down for dinner, there's a basket next to the table, and everybody puts their phone in the basket, just so we make sure that while we're together, we're actually going to talk to each other and look at each other. Um, that there be, I remember a good colleague of mine at Mundelein Seminary, the great Father Larry Hennessy, had a little tiny, it wasn't an hourglass, it was like a 15-minute, timer. And he said whenever he goes on the computer, social media, he would turn that over to make sure that he would only spend 15 minutes on it. I think some of those disciplines are really good. And I totally get how addictive these screens are. And, just as certain restaurants produce their food in a way that's meant to be very addictive, so the purveyors of social media know how to do that. They know how to produce this thing in such a way that you're just drawn into it. I think everyone that's ever been on social media knows this thing, the whole clickbait. When someone will throw a little ad and, hey, look at these pictures of whatever it is, and oh yeah, let me look at that, and all they're doing is trying to draw you into this world of ads, et cetera, et cetera. Well, and you're drawn in, and then you realize after 5 minutes, what am I doing? Why am I looking at this ridiculous ad that's telling me nothing of any importance? But it's drawn me in, just like hey, here's a piece of candy. Oh yeah, piece of candy. That sounds good. So I get that. I think the addictive thing is the most dangerous part of it spiritually. Now, at the furthest edge, pornography. But even I'm shy of pornography. There's all kinds of other forms of addiction. I think where the social media draw us in, and I know that experience of almost like you have to like shake your head, like, all right, I got to get out of that world, put that thing away, you know. Um, and yeah, I think in this article I referred to, she mentioned, is the first thing you do in the morning to go on your phone, then you got a problem. That before you uh, uh, greet your children, before anything, you're on your phone. Now I know emergencies and all that. We all get that, but there's something of the matter. Uh, so we should do a whole program just on how to avoid these addictive qualities.
Well, as we near the end here, I got a handful of rapid fire questions. So I just want to fire these
Okay.
off and get you like 1 word, 2 word responses. Okay. All right. First off,
Okay.
favorite social media platform.
Maybe a tie YouTube and Facebook.
Do you use social media more on your computer or your phone?
Um, probably phone. Probably phone.
Favorite person or group to follow on social media?
Who do I follow on social media?
It better be Word on Fire.
Okay. I do have Word on Fire app on there, No, and I think when I go through the Facebook feed sometimes, like, oh, what's going on? And I have a number of things there that some of the Catholic news stuff, like I use it for news a lot. Like, what's going on? What are people talking about today? So maybe just that news.
One thing you like most about social media?
Well, I think first of all that it's newsy. It's a way of getting plugged in. I feel more plugged in when I've looked through social media, and then I would say connection. That it is at its best a way of establishing connection. It's almost along the lines of Teilhard de Chardin's noosphere. When Teilhard dreamed that one day there'd be this kind of web. I think he even used that word, the web that would connect all of us to everybody else. And it's as though the whole planet became like an organism, like a brain. And it was a fantasy when he was talking about it, but in a way, it's come true, hasn't it? He never thought it was possible, but within 50 years, it came true. So I think that connectedness.
How about the one thing you most detest about social media?
Yeah, addiction. And it's that feeling. I can almost summon it now. That feeling I get when all right, put that thing away. You've been looking at a lot of nonsense now for the past 20 minutes, and just put it away. The addictive quality, the way it takes us away from the world, and I'll confess to it. Sometimes you're out with people, and we just do it now so naturally. Like, oh, email came. Well, I mean, what are the odds that email is of such importance that you got to look at it?
It's from the Pope. He needs me right now. Yeah.
What are the odds that the Pope is emailing you to say there's a 99.987% chance that email could be looked at later, right? But yet, isn't it true? It's the addictive. Oh, the bell went off. The buzzer. I felt the buzzer. I have to look at my stupid phone, but I do it because I've become conditioned that way. I hate that about it. I hate what it's done to us,
Not a few people have compared it to a slot machine. Like the odds are
Yeah,
really, really,
right.
really small that I'm going to win
yet-
this. Yeah.
Yeah,
Cha-ching,
no,
cha-ching.
It's exactly right. But we all sense it. You're having an in-depth conversation with someone, and then his you can hear it maybe. There's someone email came. Well, big deal. Who cares? Look at it tonight, But I do the same thing.
All right, let's close with this question. As a Catholic bishop, what's one bit of advice that you wish to give all Catholics who use social media?
Do it with love. And don't sentimentalize that word. Love means to will the good of the other. So when you're on social media, just think that. Am I doing this with love? Am I willing the good of the other as I'm involved in this world? Or am I using it as a tool of ego aggrandizement? So love. Always think, I might even recommend, put that up on your computer. To love is to will the good of the other. Okay, so make sure when you're on social media, that's what you're doing. That's my advice.
All right. Well, that sound means it is time for our question from one of our listeners. If you have a question, just go to askbishopbarron.com, record your question on any device. We'd love to hear it. Today, we get to hear from Rich, who is from your Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And
good.
He's asking about the recent interviews you did with Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro. So here's Rich's question.
Okay.
Hey, Bishop Barron. This is Rich from Los Angeles. My question is this. Now that you've been on the Rubin Report and Ben Shapiro's Sunday Special, does that mean you're a card-carrying member of the intellectual dark web? And when are you and Jordan Peterson going to sit down for a couple hours and solve all the world's problems? Thanks for all the awesome work you do, and I hope you keep it up.
Yeah, thank you for that. The intellectual dark web, I'm a little foggy on the exact meaning of it. I think it means this little coterie of people who have really made a splash through the internet, a little bit outside of the mainstream sort of vehicles of communication. And you mentioned, Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro, Joe Rogan's another one, I think, who have these podcast shows that have proven to be massively popular. And even like a format of a 2-hour or 3-hour conversation, right? And they often represent viewpoints that might not make their way into the mainstream world. So I guess that's what you mean by the intellectual dark web. And, Jordan Peterson, someone that I've written about, I admire in many ways, have questions about him as well. And Rubin and Shapiro, I've been on Rubin's show a couple times, Shapiro now once. Not that I don't know them well enough to say I really agree or disagree with all their points of view. Am I happy to be in that conversation? I say, yeah, sure. In the measure that these are, decent people who are exploring things that might not get explored otherwise. So to that degree, I suppose I'm happy to be part of it. I don't think I'm part of some grand conspiracy. Believe me, they're not like reaching out to, hey, come on, join our intellectual world. They've reached out to invite me to be on the program. So I'm in the spirit of Paul and the Areopagus. The church should go where people are talking in the culture. They should go where opinions are being shared and lively thought is on display. So that's where I've decided to join that universe.
Well, I know we get this question at least a couple times a week. When is Bishop Barron going to sit down with Jordan Peterson? And so to everybody listening to this, we are working on it. We've got some good leads. We've been talking with Dr. Peterson's people. We're hoping to do a big event in 2019. Stay tuned to the podcast. We'll give you all the details as things develop, but please just know that it's in the cards. We're definitely working on it soon. Well, Bishop, I want to thank you so much for joining us to talk about this important subject. I'd like to thank all of our listeners for listening to this episode. And stay tuned. We'll see you next week right here on the Word on Fire show. Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host. Joining us, as he does almost every single week, is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to talk with you.
Hey, Brandon. Always good to see you and talk to you.
Now, we're recording this a few weeks before the episode goes live. You're getting ready to go out of the country to Panama for the big World Youth Day. Tell us about that.
Well, actually, I leave tonight because I got to drive to L.A. and then get the plane early tomorrow morning, which goes right to Panama City. And yeah, World Youth Day, I wasn't planning on going, honestly. And then I got an invitation not that long ago to speak at the benediction, which I look forward to. It's a big gathering in this arena. I don't know how many thousands of kids, but it's a chance to speak to a lot of people at one time. And I like World Youth Day. I've been to two. I've been to Madrid and to Krakow. So it'll be my third one. And yeah, I leave tonight from here and then early tomorrow morning. Then it's a quick trip. I'm just there for Wednesday. The talk is late Wednesday evening, and I come back Thursday morning.
Bishop is speaking at a special event that's being co-organized by the USCCB, the Knights of Columbus, and Focus. And our friends at Focus are going to be live streaming the talk. And so the video will be available by the time this goes live. So if you're interested in watching Bishop Barron's talk, you can find it online. Bishop, today we're going to be talking about one of the people we focused on in a couple episodes in the past, namely Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's one of the most fascinating intellectual figures on the scene today. He's the author of the best-selling book, 12 Rules for Life, which spent many, many, many weeks on top of all the bestseller lists. I still think it's pretty high up there last time I checked. But you've recently wrote an article about Dr. Jordan Peterson and a conversation partner, Sam Harris. You said that over the holiday break, you sort of binge watched a lot of the stage dialogues that Peterson and Harris shared with each other. Maybe just to get started here, give us a refresher. Who is Dr. Jordan Peterson? What should we know about him? Why is he significant?
Well, you said most of it. I mean, he's a psychology professor from Toronto who emerged the last couple of years, really, just pretty recently, as a major internet phenomenon. Very smart guy, Jungian psychologist by training, a practicing psychotherapist, but also a theorist about a lot of cultural issues. And he came on the radar screen in Canada over a lot of this gender debates and pronouns and all that stuff. But then he started doing these talks on psychological themes and now on biblical, and I'd call them sort of spiritual themes that have been very, very popular. And, he's a smart guy who's got a knack for, kind of naming things in a provocative way. So he stirred up a lot of both controversy and enthusiasm. I've enjoyed listening to him a lot. And, so that's Jordan Peterson. And then Sam Harris, is one of the four horsemen of the new atheisms, along with Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett. Sam Harris is the fourth of the four horsemen. So these guys emerged after 9/11, early 2000s. Harris wrote a book called Letter to a Christian Nation, which is a sharp polemic against, religion, but Christianity in particular. He's also very sharp, articulate fellow. He continues to be one of the most strident critics of religion. And he and Peterson were paired because Peterson's begun speaking in a more positive way, not, as positively as I would want to speak about religion, but still quite a few steps away from Sam Harris. So they've paired them together to have these debates. So when I was home, as you say, I spent some time watching these. I enjoy that kind of thing. And I looked at a number of these conversations between him and Harris and just found them fascinating.
I want to talk about some of the ideas that they exchange, and I want to dig into that a little bit. But first of all, let's just pause and consider the significance of sort of this quasi-religious guy, Peterson, on stage with a very outspoken atheist, Sam Harris, having a civil, substantial dialogue. Like, to me, I'm like, more of that. We need more of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great. And less shouting and more conversing. I'll tell you something, too, and I'd never heard this term before, and I learned it from this debate. The moderator said, now we're going to begin tonight by asking each man to steel man the other's argument. And I thought, steel man? What does that mean? Well, then it quickly became apparent to straw man an argument, right, is to present it in the weakest way so you can just knock it down easily. So the opposite of that is to steel man, meaning as best you can, present your opponent's position strongly. Present it in the most convincing way possible. And I thought that's really a good exercise for anyone involved in this kind of debate. That would benefit people a lot on the internet, in those internet fever swamps, if they could learn to do that. To say, okay, before we go any further, I'm going to steel man your argument. I'm going to try to state as persuasively as possible what you're saying. So anyway, that's a term that I learned from watching their debates.
Now, inevitably, in each of these debates, Sam Harris begins by citing a long litany of wrongs that religion in general, but Christianity in particular, has committed over the centuries. So things like oppression, violence, slavery, genocide, inquisitions, witch hunts. But then you write in your recap of these discussions, Peterson turns attention to really two extremes that help explain some of these problems. One of them is fundamentalism. The other is chaotic relativism. Talk about those two extremes.
Yeah, I thought that was helpful. The move that Harris makes, I mean, every single critic of religion from time immemorial has made a similar move. And to fill the picture out, it's something like this. Religion is irrational. It's dogmatic. It's unself-critical. It relies on superstition and pure faith, which is why it's not surprising that it becomes so corrupt, because elements within it that would provide self-critique are eliminated. And so naturally it tends toward this kind of extreme expression. Well, see, Peterson largely agrees with that. It reminds me there of, what's his name, the great Dominican Herbert McCabe. When he would debate atheists, he would almost always begin by saying, I agree with you completely. In other words, because he thought that what they were knocking down was essentially a straw man. Well, anyway, Peterson largely agrees with that. And what he says is, it's a Jungian sort of language. There's a shadow that always haunts religion. And it's the shadow of fundamentalism. So everything I just named, unself-critical, unreasonable, fideistic, hypercritical of one's opponents, etc. Those are all marks of a fundamentalistic attitude. Maybe today we'd see it more clearly in forms of Islam, but you can see it in almost every major religion. And Peterson is saying, yeah, I grant you, that's a shadow of religion. But, as I read him, don't reduce religion to its shadow. And that's a typical Christopher Hitchens move. They all do that. They'll take the worst side of religious expression and simply say, that's religion. Where I would say with Peterson, no, that's the shadow of religion, that we have to acknowledge. Okay. Now, then Peterson makes the next move, which is to say, yeah, I'll grant you there's this shadow side, but there's another shadow, which is chaotic relativism. If you go lurching away from what you perceive as dogmatism, that you go running in the opposite direction, you can run right into the arms of this chaotic relativism. There is no truth. There is no meaning. Everything's up for grabs. Everything's relativistic. What they said, 100 years ago is no longer true. What we say now won't be true in 100 years. It's all up for grabs. Well, that, says Peterson, and I agree with him, is just as deleterious. It's just as destructive. That's the shadow, if you want, of secularist rationalism. And so might we explore the territory that lies in between fundamentalism and relativism, chaotic relativism. So I thought that was a legitimate move, and that there is plenty of space that we could move into and explore in between those two extremes.
Say a little bit more about the danger of chaotic relativism, because in your commentary on these exchanges, you've said that this relativism is anchorless, impotent, without moral seriousness, but it's proven to be just as dangerous as
Sure.
fundamentalism. How's that so?
And well, for those very reasons. See, if you say, finally, who knows what's morally right? Well, thank you. That's an invitation to every totalitarian dictator up and down the centuries. There is no morality. Therefore, why not? As wasn't it Lenin or was it Stalin? One of the two. You got to crack some eggs to make an omelet. And if that means killing a few million people, well, so be it. There is no moral absolute. That's a pretty dangerous position to move into. The same with epistemological relativism. There's no truth. Nothing's true. Well, then, see, watch out, because powerful people are going to move right into that vacuum and say, I've got no restraints. There's nothing objectively true. In fact, I'll tell you what's true. Is 2 + 2 = 5? Yeah, if I say so. See, so the trouble is if you evacuate the moral and epistemological realm of something like real objective truth, powerful people are going to move tyrannically into that space. And by God, have we seen it over the centuries, including in very recent years. So that's why I'm not going to claim with Sam Harris, oh yeah, the problem is uniquely religious fundamentalism. No. I'm just as worried, if not more worried, about a sort of secularistic fundamentalism, which is this chaotic relativism.
So you point out that we need to find sort of a middle path or a third way between these two extremes. And that's what Peterson tries to do in a lot of these discussions. But what emerges when he's talking about his solution is a Kantian approach. Now, I guess, first of all, tell us a little bit about Immanuel Kant and what's significant, at least in relation to this conversation.
Well, let me do something first, though, Brandon, because what Peterson does is, and he does it very consistently, is he will say the great narratives, let's say of the biblical tradition, which he knows the best, the great narratives of the biblical tradition contain within themselves certain moral forms and principles. And these principles are, and I think he's right about this, are best exemplified in narrative form. So you can state a moral principle abstractly, or you can tell a story that exemplifies it. Which one is better? Everyone agrees the story's better, right? Which is why the Bible has the form that it has. So in the stories of the Garden of Eden and the Tower of Babel and the flood of Noah and the call of Abraham, etc., Cain and Abel, in all these great stories, there are, I call them moral and psychological principles that are so fundamental and so ancient and so archetypal that they remain of extraordinary significance to this day, that we can't really live our moral lives outside of this kind of narrative illumination, this narrative display of the fundamentals of the moral life. That's as I take Jordan Peterson as he reads, and very effectively. I think he reads with penetrating insight a lot of these biblical stories. Now, that approach is kind of Jungian. I've used the word archetypal, and that's a Jungian term, right? The archetypes of the collective unconscious are these great patterns of meaning that are often embedded in the rituals and narratives of the great traditions. Come right up to Star Wars. So George Lucas, influenced by Joseph Campbell, who himself was a Jungian like Jordan Peterson. And you see in the Star Wars narrative, right, which, again, beautiful. Every kid in the world knows and loves that narrative. Now, why? Because it embodies certain psychological and moral structures that make our lives possible. So that's, I think, the space that Jordan Peterson likes to explore.
We've done a couple episodes on the podcast in the past about Jordan Peterson and these Jungian archetypes. So if you've missed that, if all of these names and terms are a little hazy, go back and listen to those. I think it'll fill in some of the gaps. But what you point out here in this latest commentary is that he seems to admire the moral principles and the moral framework of the Bible, but he seems somewhat ambivalent toward the historicity or the existence of metaphysical things like God or, objective morality. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, right, and that's where I see the Kantian connection. So God, and people have pressed Jordan Peterson again and again on the question, do you believe in God? And I understand his reticence about giving just some, one univocal answer, because people take the term in such a multivalent way. I get that. But what he tends to do is to bracket, as you say, the grand metaphysical questions, cosmological arguments. Is there, in fact, a first metaphysical principle that lies behind the contingency of the world? Is there, in fact, a great intelligent source behind the intelligibility of the world? And these classical cosmological arguments. He tends not so much to refute them as to set them aside and to move into, I think, a much more Kantian space. Now, here I'm referring to the great Immanuel Kant, as you say, 18th century Prussian philosopher, probably the greatest of the modern philosophers, grounded in people like, Descartes and Spinoza and so on, Hume. But Kant in some ways sums up a lot of the instincts of modern philosophy. Well, what do you find in Kant? But a very similar move. In the Critique of Pure Reason, his first great critique, he effectively brackets the metaphysical questions about God, that pure reason on its own can't attain to this metaphysical realm, because all it can really talk about, Kant says, is the world of phenomena, what appears. Phenomena as they are ordered and received by the a priori notions of the mind. So there's the Critique of Pure Reason. He tends to undo, in his mind, or unravel the classical arguments, because they don't work. However, now move to the second critique, the Critique of Practical Reason, which talks about the moral life. And here Kant uses language that I think is echoed very much in Jordan Peterson, namely that God is a sort of pure idea of the practical reason that makes the moral life possible. Now, I can't go into all the details. Read commentaries on Kant, or if you dare, get the Critique of Practical Reason and go through it. But God is what he calls a regulative idea of the practical reason. Now, take one more step. What some call the fourth critique, as a book called Religion Within the Limits of Reason Alone. Kant writes at the very end of his career. Religion, he says there, comes down fundamentally to ethics. Religion is basically about ethics. So liturgy and metaphysics and all this business, sacraments, that's all trivial or secondary. What it really comes down to is ethics. Again, that sounds a bit like Peterson, where there's a great interest in the ethical life. But then secondly, Kant says, Jesus is also a kind of regulative idea of this ethical religion. Did Jesus actually exist? I don't know. Does it matter for Kant? Not really. What matters is the role he plays in the grounding narrative of the New Testament, because he is the exemplification of the person perfectly pleasing to God, Kant says, right? The idea of the person perfectly pleasing to God appears in narrative form in the New Testament. And so as I listened to Peterson, I kept thinking, it's the Kantian approach again, tending to bracket metaphysics, focusing on ethics, on morality, and tending to see the archetypal significance of these narrative moves and characters, So in that way, I think he is Jung for our time. He's also very Nietzschean. That could be talked for another day. But I think he's also very much a Kantian figure for our time.
Now, I don't want to psychoanalyze Jordan Peterson in this podcast, and we're hoping, I know a lot of people are going to email us to ask, when are Bishop Barron and Jordan Peterson getting together? We're working on that. We've got some good leads. Hopefully we'll get you guys together here in the next few months. But when you're talking with somebody coming from a Jungian background or a Kantian background, how do you help them take the next step beyond just the archetypal analysis of, say, Jesus, and move to the historical or personal analysis?
Yeah, and that's where you are. I think here's the first move, is to say everything you said is good. I think there really are these great Jungian archetypes embedded in the biblical narratives. I agree with my friend Chris Kazor from LMU, who studied Peterson in this a lot, and said what he does corresponds to the church fathers, what they would have called the moral sense of the scripture. They say there are four senses of scripture, one of them being the moral sense. And we might say today the psychological sense, but that's what Peterson's very good at exemplifying. So I would say, yeah, good, right. I agree, I might then begin to press him, but are there other senses of the Bible? Is there more to it than is going on in those archetypal stories? In a similar way with Kant, does the New Testament, in fact, present the archetype of the person perfectly pleasing to God? Yeah, sure it does. Might we even construe a lot of the moral life in reference to that heuristic regulative idea? Yeah, sure. I'm okay with that. But there's more going on, because I would argue what really matters at the end of the day is that it happened. It really happened. It's not just an idea that's now narratively expressed. It's a real person who, historically speaking, so embodied the archetype that he transformed the whole world. This is not just a narrative projection of a heuristic or regulative idea. If you want, it's a projection of God's mind. The Word became flesh, and that matters, see? And the New Testament and the Bible as a whole is very interested in the historical manifestations and the historical ways that God has communicated himself, as well as being interested in the archetypal and heuristic level. So anyway, that's where I would tease out or try to press Jordan Peterson.
Why do you think for Jungians, for Kantians, that questions of metaphysics are bracketed? Do you think they just find them uninteresting, or are there deeper reasons?
No, I think it's because, and this is the central drama in many ways of modern philosophy, because they felt and I think with a deep frustration in a way, that they couldn't do it, that it's just not available to them. So I think Kant is with a sort of resignation, like, yeah, I kind of wish it, but pure reason just can't reach these things. And I don't think the arguments work. And so, but I'm Kant now. I'm trying desperately to hang on to what's really good and right and beautiful in religion. And this is the way to do it. Another key thing, and this is I'm boring people with these names, but this great figure of Lessing, I always forget his first name. It's either Gotthold or Gottfried or something, but Lessing, Lessing, is one of the most important players in modern thought, because he gave rise to one great idea. Lessing said, there yawns between the universal ideas of reason and the concrete facts of history a great gulf. And it's called Lessing's Gulf now. This great gully, this great gulf in between what the reason wants, which is certitude, absolute truth, and what history can deliver, which is contingent and evanescent facts of history. And you can't get from one to the other, see? So a lot of the moderns, especially in religion, are either weeping over, trying to build bridges over, running away from, hurling themselves into Lessing's Gulf, And see, in a way, Kant is responding there too by saying, finally, look, it doesn't really matter whether there really was a Jesus who did all these things. What matters is, and again, look what he's doing, staying on one side of Lessing's Gulf, the pure ideas of the universal ideas of reason, these regulative ideas of the practical reason. Sure, that's all that matters, and we can bracket history. But see, Christianity can't do that. We have to deal with Lessing's Gulf in a much more creative way than that. So that's another lecture,
Well, that sound means it's time for a question from one of our listeners. If you have a question, we'd love to hear it. Visit askbishopbarron.com. Ask anything about theology, spirituality, morality, philosophy, whatever's on your mind. We'd love to hear it. Today we have a question from Jimmy, who lives in Seattle. However, he's formerly from India, and he's asking about Hinduism and how it compares to Christianity. So here's Jimmy's question.
This is Jimmy from Seattle. I'm Catholic, originally from India. Here is a hypothetical argument my Hindu friends could make. Western Christian civilization hasn't been exemplary. The British took over India, there was slavery and the Holocaust. On the other hand, we've been a tolerant civilization. Given this context, why become Christian? Besides, I'm perfectly happy with my religion and culture. My question is, how does one respond to this line of reasoning?
Yeah, good. Thank you for that. It's going to sound maybe a little bit flip, but the answer is, well, because it's true. In other words, it's not simply a matter of which one has given rise to the best behavior. Let's say every single Christian in the world was a complete jerk. Well, but still Christianity is true, So that's the reason. So you'd have to argue on different grounds there. Now, having said that, is it supposed to make people better? Yes, indeed. Is it a scandal that lots of Christians have behaved in reprehensible ways? Absolutely. And it does indeed undermine evangelization. I get that. Now, I'd also maybe play a little bit on the other side of the question. I'm not entirely convinced that Hinduism has always been a model of toleration and nonviolence. I mean, Gandhi didn't meet with immediate agreement when he spoke to his Hindu fellow believers about nonviolence. In fact, Gandhi learned that from Matthew's Gospel when he was a young law student in London. Talk to people today who are victims of forms of Hindu fundamentalism. So again, just to maybe caution, I don't think it's simply an either or, like those terrible Christians and these lovely Hindus. My own Christian convictions lead me to say that human beings are a bad lot. We just tend to go bad. And I'm pretty confident anywhere you look, anywhere in the world, you're going to find a lot of very bad behavior. So in a way, I suppose that balances itself out. That's a more of a secondary question. What finally matters is it true? Is it true? Is God real? Did he send his son? Did he rise from the dead? We'd have to look at those questions, I suppose, first.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Listen, we mentioned this last week, but tomorrow, Tuesday, February 29th, begins our first ever Word on Fire Institute online summit. This is a virtual event for 3 days where we have expert interviews with people like Bishop Barron, our Word on Fire Institute fellows. The whole theme is evangelizing the unaffiliated. So you're going to want to sign up. Just go to wordonfireshow.com/summit. Well, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.